Welcome and good morning. This is the Veterans Forum. The program is coming to you from the studios of Bedford Television's Community Television here in Bedford, New Hampshire. My name is Bob Stevens, and I've had the pleasure and honor of producing this show and hosting it for about 12 years now. For those of you who do not know, this program is in cooperation with the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project. It was started back in the year 2000, wherein they have asked that stations such as this throughout the country, that guys like me, offer each and every veteran, male or female, who served anywhere, the opportunity to share their experiences in a televised interview that will become part of the database that goes down to the Library of Congress. So that we, in effect, we are making history, but we're recording the history as it was made by the people who made it, so that there's nothing in the way that can be, shall we say, mixed up or misconstrued or denied. Before I start, though, there's something I'd like to share with you. About 2-3 weeks ago now, I received a notice that there's a special telephone system, a number 211, that any guy or gal who served or their friends who feel that some veteran may need some help in any category, dial that number again, 211, and you'll be put in touch with a cadre of all kinds of counselors and help that you may be needing. And don't forget, it's there for your helping. If you don't ask for it, you won't get it, but you deserve it. Go for it. Today is another show that we're going to work with a fellow who did his thing a few years ago, what he did and how he did it. I'm going to ask Gary, if you will, to introduce himself, and we'll start the show from there. Again, sir, good morning and welcome. Would you tell us your name? Spell your last name for the record.
Sure, Bob. My name's Gary Backus. The last name is B-A-C-K-U-S. I live here in Bedford at 24 Winding Road, and we've been here in Bedford about 15 years now.
Well, you're going to make it permanent, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Okay, but what was your branch of service in your service state?
So I served in the United States Air Force. I went in October of 1973, and I served until the right at the end of December of 1997.
Wow.
So 24 years.
24 years. Couldn't hold down a real job, huh?
Not a real job.
Oh, wonderful to help. Okay, what I'd like to do, now that we know who you are as of today, is go back and find out how you got here. For example, if you will, where and when were you born? Mm-hmm. What was your life like growing up and so forth as a child? Anybody in your family in the service? What things stand out in your memory that were big and important, or the other
Sure.
ones?
So I was, I'm a native of Southern California. I was born and raised in Southern California, just outside of Los Angeles. Was born in Santa Ana. And in fact, my mother lives not far from there now in Anaheim, not very far from Disneyland. So I grew up in a time when Southern California was still very open. A lot of orange trees. I remember going to Disneyland as a child. It was completely surrounded by orange groves.
Wow.
They're gone
Not
now.
Today.
Not today.
Not today.
Not today. So my father had served in the Navy right at the very end of World War II. I had an uncle who served in the United States Marine Corps on Guadalcanal during the World War II. So I have some military history in the family. Mm-hmm. And it was important for me to continue that service.
Amen. Now, do you have any brothers and sisters?
I do.
Family life?
I have one brother who's 5 years younger than I am. He also lives out in Southern California still. He works for a university out there as a computer programmer.
Good.
So growing up in Southern California was a unique experience. We had a lot of open space, and we played a lot of sports in the local fields, and just had a real good time out there. But as I started to, after I graduated from high school, and I had worked a little bit at a couple of different jobs. I worked at a drive-in dairy. I worked at a men's clothing store. I worked in a warehouse. Went to school for about a year in college. Finally decided that none of that was right for me, and it was time to do something important. So that's when I decided to join the Air Force.
Why the Air Force?
Well, interesting story.
Here we go.
Here we go. So shortly out of high school, I started getting the usual phone calls from all the local recruiters. That would have been 1973, 1974. So we were still very much embroiled in the Vietnam conflict at that time. So I kept telling the recruiters I was not interested in the military, not interested. Finally, the Army recruiter convinced me to come talk to him. I had a unique experience in junior high and high school. I was fortunate enough and smart enough to sign up to take Chinese Mandarin as a foreign language in junior high and high school.
Everybody does that.
Everybody does that, right? And as I was, during those years in junior high and high school, my instructor at the time, who was a native Chinese, told me several times about the opportunities that the military offered for linguists.
Oh.
And so I went to see the Army recruiter and told the recruiter I was interested in going to the Army language school at the Presidio of Monterey in California and being a linguist for the Army. And he tried to convince me that they needed people to do other things. And I said I wasn't interested in that. It was either the language route or nothing. So as I left the recruiter, on a whim, I walked into the Air Force recruiter's office. Told him I was interested in being a Chinese linguist for the Air Force, and his eyes got real big, and he brought out all the paperwork and pretty much signed me up right there on the spot. Little did I know at the time that the Air Force recruiters were getting a bonus for recruiting linguists for the service. So the rest of that is pretty much history. So I just decided that day right then and there.
Are you very adept at different languages or just Chinese?
So I've actually had formal training in the military in both Chinese Mandarin and Russian. I have 3 tours of duty to the Defense Language Institute at the Presidio of Monterey, once for Chinese Mandarin, primarily an oral comprehension course. So I can't sit down and read the Chinese newspaper or write the characters, but I can translate a bit.
Okay.
And then 2 tours, both for basic and then a tour for intermediate Russian. I went. So after my first overseas tour, I went back for Russian school in the mid-'70s, and then in early '80s I went back for intermediate Russian after another overseas tour.
Go back a bit. You jumped one big span.
Exactly, I sure did.
But that's life. Where and when did you get into the Army officially, or the Air Force?
The Air Force. So
and how?
So after I signed up with the recruiter, which was midsummer, I went on to the delayed enlistment program. 1973. Spent the summer wrapping up personal business, things like that. I reported to the enlistment processing station in the latter part of October in Long Beach, California, and went through all of the physicals and all the paperwork and all of that. And because I was a 6-year enlistee when I went into the Air Force, because they required that of all language students because of the length of the tech schools, they left me in charge of the group of 30 or so enlistees that were headed for San Antonio, Texas, and Lackland Air Force Base. So on the early morning of Halloween, October 31st, 1973, we got on a bus, rode to Los Angeles International Airport, got on an airplane, flew to San Antonio, Texas, and after we landed in San Antonio, we were bused to Lackland Air Force Base. And I recall as if it were yesterday when the drill instructor stepped onto that bus and wished us all happy Halloween. Get off the bus. And
in those words?
In those words.
Oh,
happy
wow,
Halloween, get off the bus.
Yeah.
So, and then it all started that evening.
Okay.
So.
Then the transition, this is always fun. It's the same thing, but everybody has a different take. What did you feel like with the first 2 or 3 days when you were going from, if you will, PFC, Proud Free Civilian,
right,
to GI?
So there, it is.
Share those.
It's a culture shock. It truly is. You know, the poor kid from Southern California who thinks he's going to go into the military and go to language school. You've got to get through the hoops of basic military training first, and that is a shock. So the dormitories at Lackland Air Force Base were very modern. They were 2- and 3-story facilities, and the ground level was open, and we had drill pads down there. That very first night after we got off the bus, we went up, and our dormitory was on the 3rd floor, and the drill instructors had us running up and down the stairs for what seemed like hours until we were completely worn out, just to kind of get all of that excitement out of us, I think, for that very first night. But I can't tell you how many times it runs through your mind when you ask yourself, what am I doing here?
Why?
Why did I do this to myself?
Yeah.
So basic training was once you get used to the routine.
Okay.
Of them.
What was your routine? Because everything seems to be a special branch.
Right, right. So I actually have a couple of brother-in-laws who are in the United States Marine Corps, and they always give me a hard time when we talk about the differences in basic training between the Air Force and the Marine Corps. The Air Force is very, at the time, very much focused on a lot of educational kinds of things to teach you about Air Force history. And I won't say that the physical part was not stressed, because it was. We did a lot of physical training as well. But it was pretty well balanced, half and half, between physical activity, running, marching, getting used to marching in a formation. But there was also a lot of classroom work for history and military law.
Was there any sort of a proviso that if you didn't meet a certain criteria, you went back and started over again?
Yes.
Or did you just pass period?
No. Obviously, if you couldn't make the physical requirements, you could be set back to an earlier class where you could have more opportunity to become physically fit as they needed. Toward the end of my stay in basic training, myself and several of my squadron mates contracted measles, and we were exempted from some of the activities at the very end of basic training. So we had been practicing the confidence course for weeks.
That's called the obstacle course.
The obstacle course.
The grinder. Or
exactly.
Whatever. Everybody has a different name.
All right. So the day that we were supposed to go do the confidence course for real, for the grade, to be able to pass basic training, there were 4 or 5 of us that were in the hospital with the measles. Fortunately, they didn't set us back to another class. They said, "You've already done this in training. We'll count that." So, but at the time, basic training in the Air Force was about 6.5 weeks long.
Okay.
And
how were the instructors as far as their demeanor? Were they like the old Hollywood type back in World War II, grunt and groan, or they were more polite? Or you tell me.
So we actually had one of each.
Oh.
So there was a good cop, bad cop going on. We had the senior drill instructor was a technical sergeant, and he had been in Vietnam, a couple of tours in Vietnam, and he fit the profile of the crusty old drill instructor.
Okay.
He was nobody's friend. And then there was a younger buck sergeant who was very helpful. Was always showing us not necessarily shortcuts, but easier ways of doing things to help us get through basic training. So we had a little bit of each, and I think they really showed us a breadth of experiences, and I know that even though a lot of us did not appreciate some of the things that the technical sergeant drill instructor were having us do, a lot of us soon realized that a lot of his demeanor was a result of his experiences in combat in Vietnam. So that really drove that home for us.
And it makes you feel good in retrospect. Boy, we did it, but am I glad we did it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's great. Now, where and when were you selected or had a chance to opt for what you were going to do as far as your training, your MOS, as far as your language and so forth?
So the services generally have a battery of tests that they ask you to take, and that helps determine what you're eligible for: mechanical, electrical, administrative kinds of things. They also administer, on a voluntary basis, a test for language aptitude. And when you take this test, it is a kind of an artificial language. So it's not Spanish, French, or Italian, or something like that. It's a language that you have no experience with. And they show you a few words, give you a little translation, and then they throw some sentences at you to see if you can, from the context, So after you take that test, you get a score, and if you score high enough, you have enough aptitude to take a language. Surprisingly enough, with my history with Chinese in junior high and high school, I barely passed the language aptitude test.
But you passed.
But I passed. So once you pass that test, you're then eligible to go to the language school, which I had actually signed up for on my original contract with the Air Force. So I had a contract going in with the Air Force. The actual career field on that contract was one that was at the time called interrogator-interpreter.
Oh.
So several of us thought we were going to be the guys that were going to be interrogating, prisoners of war and things like that. And as it turns out, after we got to the language school, there was more interpreter than interrogator in that career field. So, but that's how we ended up getting there. There was a delay between basic training and us actually traveling out to Monterey, California for the language school. We had to wait for the next class to start. So when I graduated basic training in the latter part of December, I actually was granted a week's of vacation leave to head back home, spend the holidays with the family. Then I went back to Lackland and was there from early January until March of 1974. We were in casual status, so there was a lot of KP, a lot of guard duty.
Picking it up if it's not growing.
We painted rocks white, we cleaned flower beds, we mowed lawns, we did all kinds of great things. And then when the class time came around, they shipped two class. There was my class of Chinese Mandarin, and another class of Russian was starting at the same time. So they shipped about 60 of us students from Lackland Air Force Base out to Monterey, California.
Wonderful. Nice country to be working around there, too.
Beautiful out there.
Now, question. Were you trained in any way as far as how to speak the language so that you could understand and hear it rather than just be able to read it?
Right. So the Chinese Mandarin course was one that was termed an oral comprehension course. So we were trained to listen and interpret back into English. Very little exposure to written characters, or we weren't able to sit down and read a Chinese newspaper, and speaking was not emphasized, although there was some of that. The language school in Monterey is fairly unique in that the vast majority of all the instructors out there are native speakers, and
native of the country.
Native from that country.
Okay.
And after about the first week of school, English isn't spoken in the classroom again. So yeah. So the normal day was there was 3 hours of intensive classroom work in the morning, a 2-hour lunch break in which you were expected to get caught up on your homework, maybe have an inspection of your dormitory, 3 hours of intensive classroom in the afternoon, and then for those students who were perhaps struggling with it, there was a 2-hour study hall in the evening. Right. So with my history in the language, I was doing very well in the class. Didn't have to take the mandatory study halls in the evening, but I went in and helped some of the other students who were struggling. So, you get very close with a class like that. So
yeah, you share, and just by practicing with them, it makes you that much better.
Exactly. So when I went back to the language school in 1975 for basic Russian, this was a new language for me, and I had to work considerably harder at that. The day was exactly the same, 3 hours of classroom in the morning, a 2-hour lunch break, 3 hours of classroom in the afternoon. That course was a fairly standard language kind of course where they teach you to speak it as well as translate it from listening to it.
Similar to what you'd have in high school or college?
Exactly. When you graduate from, so each of these courses, the Chinese course was 32 weeks long. The Russian course is a year long. So we were out there for an extended period of time. When we graduated from the basic Russian course, when I graduated in 1970, it would have been 1976, 1977, or the spring of 77. When we graduated from that, we had roughly the equivalent of a 4-year college education in that language, as if you'd specialized in that language. And then I took an overseas tour, and then I came back for intermediate Russian.
Let's not just flip over that overseas, because it's part of it. But I would say, what's your first time you practiced what you were preaching? As far as your next assignment, where'd you go and how did it work?
Sure. So my first overseas assignment with my Chinese language was Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, Japan. I was there for a year and a half. I was fortunate enough when I went through some of the training courses that I was in the top 10% of the class, and those honor graduates, so to speak, were offered the opportunity to become an airborne linguist for the Air Force. So the Air Force has both airborne language specialists that do.
What does that imply? I don't understand the term.
So that means that I would fly on an Air Force intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance collection platform and provide strategic indication and warning intelligence back to our nation's leaders.
So you're tapping into somebody else's radio work? Is that it?
I have to be very careful. How I
shoot me. Don't shoot me.
I do. So many facets of that job were and remain classified.
Okay. We don't go there.
We won't go there. But yes, the mission of those aircraft is something called signals intelligence, and it is there to inform the combatant commanders about potential enemy intent, and to provide strategic indications and warning to our national command authorities.
Wow.
So I spent my entire career as both a Chinese and a Russian linguist in the airborne program. So back to my tours. My first tour was in Okinawa, Japan, about a year and a half. Went back to language school for Russian. After I graduated from Russian, I was fortunate enough to get an assignment to RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom. And as I went from tech school to that assignment in the UK, I married my wife, Michelle. And
Did she go with you?
She went with me. I had to go first. I had to go find an apartment to rent and get settled and get a car. But once all of that was done, she joined me. I got there in November, and she joined me after the first of the year.
Wonderful.
And we spent 3 years at RAF Mildenhall. Absolutely wonderful assignment. Loved the UK. We've been back on vacation several times.
Okay. And it's a particular thing that stands out that keeps you going back there.
Yeah. So my wife is very much an English history buff.
Oh.
So she loves English history. In fact, our kids tease her regularly. Our library is full of Grandma's yucky history books. So, but when we first got over there, the house that we rented was a 400-year-old cottage in a little town called Fornham All Saints, which was about 15 miles from RAF Mildenhall, where I worked. And we lived right next door to the little grocery store. Every little town in England has its own little grocery, and right down the street from the pub. It's just a slower kind of lifestyle.
Almost Rockwellian, if that's a good
absolutely
term. British Rockwellian.
Exactly. The drive to and from the base back to home was through the beautiful countryside, and it was normal to be slowed down by having a farmer's tractor out in front of you on the highway, or a herd of sheep. Exactly, the sheep right down the road. So we got a chance to see a lot of English history, visit a lot of the old castles and the abbeys, and we have since been back. A few years ago, I took my wife back to see Shakespeare live on stage at the Shakespeare Theater in Stratford-on-Avon, and
that's a reconstructed one.
Yeah, exactly.
That was building when we were there.
Right. So I had a 3-year tour to RAF Mildenhall. While we were there, both of my daughters were born in RAF Mildenhall, and it's interesting that when children of service members are born overseas, they, at least in the UK, they have dual citizenship until they turn 18. So my girls grew up as dual citizens of the US and the UK. They had UK health cards for the UK health system, and they have UK birth certificates.
How about rail passes and that kind of
No,
stuff?
none of those good
That's
things.
extra.
None of those are all extra. And then, so after that tour to RAF Mildenhall, we went back to the language school, and I had an opportunity to take intermediate Russian, and then I had a little over a 2-year tour to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska. And you probably wonder what on earth a Russian linguist is doing in Omaha, Nebraska. Well, Offutt Air Force Base happens to be the home base of the 55th Wing, which is it's the owner and operator of the aircraft that I flew on.
Okay.
So all of the aircraft permanently live at Offutt, and then they deploy to the forward operating bases of Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, or RAF Mildenhall, or some of the other places where they deploy for maybe 60 days or so, and the crews rotate in and out from home station.
Well, dollars and cents. As you're progressing, how are you, if you will, rewarded by promotions from whatever you started, corporal, private, up through the line? That's important to know.
It is. And there were always contentious issues about promotions between the language fields, because you had the linguists who had been through the exact same training that I had that went to what are termed ground sites. So they go to an intelligence collection facility, or perhaps they go to work for the National Security Agency. And then there are those of us that flew
Up in the air.
Up in the air. So for the linguists that flew, we received decorations for our aerial achievements that our ground counterparts did not get, and those decorations counted for promotion. They're points for promotion. As it turned out in my particular case, I don't think I was promoted any quicker than any of my counterparts at
they was lax.
Exactly. But so as I mentioned earlier, I joined the Air Force as a 6-year enlistee, which meant as soon as I graduated basic training, I had 2 stripes, and I was an airman first class.
Good.
And during my first overseas tour to Okinawa, I was promoted to sergeant. And
today, that's what, about an E3, E4?
It's E4.
Okay.
E4.
I'm the old type. Had to go by stripes, not E's and so forth.
Right. So the Air Force has changed that rank structure since I was at that rank. They now call an E4 a senior airman, and then you go straight to staff sergeant. But when I was in, you went airman first class, sergeant, and then staff sergeant. So the Air Force has technically done away with the rank of what you would consider a buck sergeant, but E4 is still there, but they're considered an airman. And the reason they did that is they have the airman ranks, the NCO ranks, and the senior NCO ranks, and they've tried to block those off.
We'll get to that in a second.
Right. So I was fortunate enough to get promoted to staff sergeant during one of my later tours while I was at Omaha. I made technical sergeant before my second tour to Okinawa in Kadena Air Base. That would have been in the early 80s.
Yeah.
Early 80s. While I was at Okinawa, I made master sergeant, came back to the States, had another tour in Omaha, Nebraska, and then had an opportunity during the first Persian Gulf War to move to Headquarters Strategic Air Command, which was also at Offutt Air Force Base, as a liaison between my major command in the intelligence side of the house and Strategic Air Command, where we were pushing our air crews into the Middle East to support the first Persian Gulf War. And while I was there, Strategic Air Command was shut down, and it was moved to Air Combat Command, which was out at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. So when SAC was closed down, I moved to Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, and served a couple of years out there in the Reconnaissance Division at Air Combat Command. And while I was there, I was promoted to Senior Master Sergeant.
Wow.
And that's
been a down the circle.
Yeah, exactly. So and I retired as a Senior Master Sergeant.
Good. After what, 28, 29? 24
years.
Okay.
24 years.
I'm kind of at a loss because there's so many things I want to ask, but as you said, if you tell me, you'll have to shoot me. And this is a brand new shirt.
We wouldn't want to do anything to the brand new shirt.
Are there on either side, in the Pacific and the Atlantic, was there a difference as far as how you were received by the people that you were then living with and working with?
So we were received much closer, I think, by the folks in the UK. A lot of people think the British are kind of standoffish, and I think that's counter to our experience. We very much enjoyed that tour, but Britain is so much like the U.S. in many ways. They spell a few things differently.
Yeah, with the O and the U.
Exactly. But our time in Okinawa was I think rewarding as well, but for very different reasons. My children, who have grown up literally all over the world, still talk, I'll say fondly, about our time in Okinawa. We lived for a while off base within the Okinawan community for about 8 or 9 months, and then we received base housing. So we moved back onto base, and we're right in the middle of the Americans again. But it's a very different cultural shift in Japan. And frankly, there were a lot of things that were going on during the 80s where the local Okinawans were not real enamored with the U.S. military. And there were fairly regular demonstrations outside the main base. They didn't want to have the Americans there. So we pretty much stuck to the base. We did a few trips around the island to see some of the sites and to visit some of the memorials from World War II. But I think we enjoyed our time in the UK much more.
Yeah, it was more our style, if you will, of living.
Exactly, exactly.
Now, to that point, and you talked about your girls, but have they, over the years, tried to compare one with the others, which they liked better and which they didn't
so
like?
So they were very young when we were being born dynamic. In the UK. They were 2 and 3 when we left there. So they don't remember an awful lot about that. But they're full of memories from our 3 years in Okinawa. We were fortunate enough, my wife's younger brother, actually 2 of her younger brothers who were active duty Marines at the time, one was actually stationed in Okinawa for a while we were there. So we had family and he had family. And her other brother made a trip over there as part of the Inspector General team for the Marine Corps. So he had a chance to come visit us while we were there as well. But my girls talk about, so Okinawa, obviously a major battle in World War II. A lot of ordnance expended on that island.
Oh, yeah.
There is a lot of unexploded ordnance still on that island. There were, on the Armed Forces Network television channel, there were regular TV commercials warning children not to pick up unexploded shells. We had a personal experience when we were out snorkeling a block from where we lived off base. There had been a major storm, a typhoon, the week before, and we were just out snorkeling in fairly shallow water and came across a 50-millimeter cannon shell left over from World War II, just floating there in the water, unexploded. They were doing some restoration work on the gas station at Kadena Air Base, and they bumped into a 1,000-pound unexploded bomb at the gas station.
Thing you read about the reconstruction work that they've been doing in Britain and all the tunneling and so forth.
Right.
Be careful where you step. It may be your last step.
Exactly. So my all 3 of my kids, my 2 daughters and my son, all have memories of those commercials. And there's a poisonous snake on the island of Okinawa called a habu.
Yep.
And so when the kids were out on the playground, every once in a while, the bells would ring and the security police would come and take care of the snake that was found on the playground. So they all remember those, and they joke about those regularly.
Well, I was told, I think, maybe I have the wrong island, but there's also a snake that if it bit you, they called it the two-stepper. One struck, 1 step, 2 steps, and you're dead before you hit the ground.
Exactly.
There's no anti-serum for that.
Right.
It's kind of scary.
It is scary. But we got through all of that, and I think the kids have had a wonderful experience, and they talk fondly of all the things that they've had a chance to do.
Wonderful.
So, yeah.
And we haven't violated any secrets.
No secrets yet.
Okay, let's segue a bit now that you're all through. We talked earlier that you took advantage of the GI Bill.
Yes,
or
I did.
Used the GI Bill, not take advantage of it.
Yes, I did. I had the opportunity. So the Air Force has an organization called the Community College of the Air Force, which is essentially a 2-year college. And while you're on active duty, you can take courses. And
you have to be in attendance or by
you can do both.
Oh.
So you can do correspondence, you can do bypass tests if you've got experiences before that, or you can take courses. They all count. So while I was in my second tour of Okinawa in Japan, I took advantage of that and got my associate's degree in translating and interpreting. And then much later in my career, prior to my retirement in 1997, I started in the mid-90s or so to take additional college classes on the GI Bill at the time. And just before I retired in 97, I got my bachelor's degree in management and supervision. So I was able to take advantage of those GI benefits. We've bought multiple homes depending on where we were around the country at the time. The GI Bill has afforded us the opportunity to do GI loans for homes.
Yeah, that 375 was a godsend.
Exactly. So, very, very positive experience with the benefits and certainly.
What did that lead to? What kind of business are you now in or were in? So
I was. Again, it's an interesting story that has brought me to New England and to New Hampshire.
It's your show.
After I completed that bachelor's degree, my wife's parents lived in Sanford, Maine, and my father-in-law, who was always very quick to give me a hard time whenever he could.
That guy my daughter married.
Yeah, started to poke me a little bit and said, "So now what are you going to do now that you've grown up and you've got a college degree?" And I said, "Well, find me a job, and we'll see." So he mailed me a few newspapers from Boston and from Portland, Maine, and there was an advertisement for a company down in Bedford, Massachusetts called the MITRE Corporation. That was advertising for work with the Air Force in communications. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. So I sent a resume and was lucky enough that my resume was seen by a wonderful guy that I still work with 16 and a half years later, who's a retired F-15 fighter pilot, who was, the company at the time was working for the Air Force to develop a brand new digital data link to send information around between intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platform, and to actually put it into the cockpit of a fighter to give them greater situation awareness. So it's on all the displays, and it works just like their radars do. It shows right up on their screens. And he called me one Saturday morning and said, "How'd you like to come and work for us and train fighter pilots how to use the data link?" And I said, "That sounds like that would be a great opportunity."
Absolutely.
So I came to work for the MITRE Corporation, which MITRE is a nonprofit organization that operates federally funded research and development centers.
501c stuff?
Yes. So I currently serve in MITRE's Center for National Security, and I work down at Hanscom Air Force Base in Lexington, Massachusetts. And I am the Senior Technical Advisor for the Space, Aerial, and Nuclear Networks Division Data Links and Gateways Branch.
Wow.
So it's a long title.
You have a pretty big business card.
It is, you know.
You fold it up.
But so I have the opportunity to continue to serve the Air Force and to continue to try to improve their communications and keep the Air Force as the #1 fighting air and space force in the world.
Just by, this is an aside, but just by looking at your face when you talk about it, you're one of the rare people who has a job that he likes and likes doing it.
I do. I've moved up through the ranks, so to speak.
Yeah, but you paid your dues.
I've paid my dues. You know, I'm now a project leader, so I have a lot of management headaches that I have to deal with. But it's very rewarding to go to the field and to see something new to be installed in the fighter force, and then to see them use it and now count on it as just another weapon. We've had fighter pilots tell us that the introduction of data links into those fighter platforms was as revolutionary as radar was when it was installed. So it has been very rewarding to continue that work and to continue to serve the Air Force. So
now, shifting more gears, I can see here that you've done more than one thing, but what do you do, as if you will, as far as the VFW, the American Legion, and so forth? You join them?
Yes, I sure do. I joined. I have 100 interesting stories, but I got
we've
to
got 17
we got
minutes.
17 more minutes. So
Go.
So how I got to the VFW was 22 years ago. I had mentioned my in-laws were up in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
One of my sister-in-laws decided she wanted to get married up in Maine at Nubble Lighthouse. She wanted an outdoor wedding at Nubble Lighthouse. Beautiful setting up there. And they were looking for a place to have the reception. And they found the VFW hall in Sanford Springvale that had a facility that was what they wanted to rent, but you needed to be a member of the VFW to rent it. So I said, well, I qualify for the VFW. During one of my tours to Omaha, Nebraska, I served in the Grenada operation, and that allowed me to have the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, which is one of the prerequisites for membership in the VFW, to have served actually in a war zone and be decorated with those kinds of decorations. So I joined the VFW post in Sanford Springvale on a whim so that we could rent the hall.
Okay, a member in absentia then.
Exactly. We lived down here in Bedford, and I was not really active in the post up there, but I kept my membership going because I thought that was important to support the veterans. About 6 or 7 years ago, the previous commander here at the Bedford VFW gave me a call and said, why don't you come visit our post and think about transferring your membership from Maine to New Hampshire. So I did, and I was very impressed with the post. We have a wonderful VFW post here in Bedford, New Hampshire. It's VFW post 8401, the Richard K. Harvell post. Richard K. Harvell was a Bedford native who was killed in the Vietnam War. So we honor his memory by naming our post after him. So I started to go to the VFW meetings. Very much enjoyed being around the veterans that were there, saw the work that was being done, became more active in the post, served as a post trustee for a year, served as the post senior vice commander for a year, and I am now entering my 3rd year as the post commander here at...
Sure.
Thank you, sir. This last year, I had the honor to serve also as the state surgeon for the state of New Hampshire at the state VFW level.
State surgeon?
State surgeon. Surgeon is the, there are 5 officer positions within the VFW at the state level. It goes, the progression is surgeon, chaplain, junior vice commander, senior vice commander,
I thought I meant
and
you
commander.
Studied medicine somewhere.
Negative. It's ceremonial. It is not medical. I made that very clear up front.
A bandage roll.
Yeah, exactly. So in that role as state surgeon, I was responsible for getting information out about health care and benefits of interest to veterans.
Very important.
To all of the posts. I was responsible for the suicide prevention program, which I worked closely with the VA hospital in Manchester, and we mailed packets of suicide prevention materials out to all of the posts in the state of New Hampshire. And I was also the hospital chairman, so I teamed with the Ladies Auxiliary hospital chair, and we did Christmas parties at White River Junction Med Center and at Manchester Med Center, and scheduled hospital visits, for ailing veterans. So it's been a very, very rewarding year to do that.
Did that include working transportation and so forth?
Sometimes,
lining it up,
sometimes it does. You know, if we need to transport folks to get
a
to
lot
get
of
their care.
activity from here down into Jamaica Plain, the Boston area.
Exactly. I'm also a member of the Bedford Post 54, the Buswell, the Stevens Buswell Post of the American Legion. And this year I serve as their Sergeant at Arms in that post as well. So very active in Veterans Affairs. You know, a full-time job in the VFW work. My wife often asks me when when I'm going to have some spare time to do things with the family. So
but one of the things I found, I have been a member, but I'm, I guess, disenfranchised now because when I left Massachusetts, I didn't find a place here that I felt I was able to or could get into. But the thing that I'm liking to do now with this program, I'm taking some of your time, is to make sure that any guy or gal who sees the program, and as you said, with your help, get the word out so that we'll answer for the families the questions that most of you know, hey, Dad, what did you do in the war?
absolutely.
A lot of guys won't talk. Some will. Others say, no, I just had a job to do. But the important thing is to record what they did and how they did it so that it's not convoluted. And I've heard all kinds of stories about what some of our enemies are now doing with history books. You know, Bataan never happened. Auschwitz, you're crazy, never happened.
Right.
And that stuff cannot be over.
Exactly. And it's important for us to make sure that the younger generations understand what we have been through. We are blessed in our post to have a handful of remaining World War II veterans. One of which was on Omaha Beach on D-Day morning, was a corpsman, Navy corpsman medic, and the things that he has done need to be recorded for all posterity.
Is he still about?
He is.
Maybe we can talk to him.
We should, absolutely. You know, there's been a news story recently here that kind of goes back and connects me to the work that I did for the Air Force. Both Fox News and CNN and some of the print service-related articles have spoken recently about an incident in the Far East between Russia and the U.S. There was an RC-135, which is what I flew when I was in the Air Force, was over international waters, and a Russian fighter came up and flew within 100 feet of it, and caused a bit of an international incident, and that's managed to make the news. So I was quick to point out to my kids that are now grown, and they grew up with Dad putting on a flight suit and going to work in the morning and fly a mission and come home 12 hours later, and it was no big deal. But now, as they're grown adults, and I say, you see that just happened? Well, that used to happen to me all the time. You know, when we flew, that was a routine kind of an occurrence. You know, I have this picture here of what the view out of my previous office window used to look like.
So, I'm going to cut him off here.
Oh, sorry.
Let's bring some of this up because this is important. And I'll try to hold it up so that, I don't know where the camera is, but can you get a good picture of that? Bill?
Yes, Bob.
Oh.
I'm taking it.
Oh, okay. You tell us about that, please.
So this is at the time a Soviet MiG-31, known to NATO forces as a Foxhound. This is the view out of my previous office window. This was fairly routine, that as we would fly our missions over international waters and in international airspace, that the Russians and the Soviets would come up and escort us for a while, just to make sure we weren't doing anything we weren't supposed to do. And quite frankly, the United States Air Force does the exact same thing. When the Russian Bears come fly near Alaska, they escort them as well. So this was an example that I've used with my kids recently, based on the episode that happened back about a month ago over in the Far East with the Russians. But this kind of drives home what I did for my time in the Air Force with my children. They now understand that a little bit more now that they're adults.
Daddy didn't have it all fun and games.
Exactly. So,
okay. Now, this one here we have to show, I think. The kids. here's another corker, Bill.
So
Who's who?
so this is a very young me. This would have been 1975, and this was my roommate, Joe Consoretti. Joe and I had been through basic training together. We had been through casual together at Lackland Air Force Base. We had been through language school at Monterey together. I went to Chinese, he went to Russian, and we were stationed together at in Okinawa. This was the day that we were both issued our very first flight suit, and we had just bought a camera, so the camera is balanced on the upper bunk of the bed on the timer so that it could take our picture in our brand new flight suit.
That's
So
the day
we were
they
so
call
proud.
selfies.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
before all this new stuff
right.
came
Yeah,
about.
so there was no selfie then, but it was the equivalent of a selfie
Okay.
at the
Now,
time.
do you still keep in touch with each other?
It's been a long time since I've spoken with my friend Joe. But it's there are friends that you make in the military that
yeah.
you do
A
stay in touch
lifetime.
with. Absolutely. Very good friend of mine now is my hunting buddy. We go out to the Midwest and we go hunting almost every year together. And
Where? Montana?
Nebraska.
Nebraska?
Asking Nebraska.
What did you shoot, corn?
Not quite, but there's a couple of 100,000 acres of public land out there in the Sandhills that has whitetail and mule deer in it,
Ooh.
and we just love to get out there and get away from everything.
It's a new world.
There's no cell phone coverage. There's no TV out there. It's
And
just wonderful.
No Dunkin' Donuts.
Exactly. We're on our own out there.
Yeah, let's do this. This kind of the grand prize. I'll have to hold it so we don't get us private.
So this was a very special mission that we flew out of Okinawa. This would have been in about 1985 or 86. Our normal mission durations were about 12 hours long. So from takeoff to landing, about 12 hours. This particular day, this gentleman right here in the middle is a two-star general with the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. He was the chief of their intel branch. And we put this crew together and we flew a mission to show him what the U.S. Air Force RC-135s were capable of doing on a normal mission, and how that intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance information gets through the system and back to the consumers of the intelligence. This is a somewhat younger me hidden back here in the back row, standing right behind the squadron commander at the time. So that was a very interesting mission to have the Japanese general on board, and it was my job to take him around the various positions on the airplane and explain to him what all the operators were doing.
Were all these guys in one crew, or there was several planes?
That is one crew. A crew
Wow.
on an RC-135 is 34 individuals. So
Okay, let me put this down for a second. Now we get down to the real show and tell. I don't want to break it.
that's fine.
Off we go, my buddy.
So this is a model of an RC-135. This particular aircraft was one that we took to the Philippines on a typhoon evacuation. So as the typhoons would come through, Okinawa is a very small island, and normally these aircraft were just parked in revetments outside at Kadena Air Base. But when the typhoons came, we packed up the crews in the airplanes and at the time took them to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, which Clark is now closed. But this is an RC-135. They are a little different now. When this model was built, we had these style engines. They've re-engined them so that they'll fly for another 20 years with the new CFM 56 engines, which are a little more fuel efficient
Who
and
makes
provide
them?
a little power. So those engines are built by,
Uh-oh, don't
Tough
tell
question.
me. I don't want to be shot.
you know, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I don't
I'd like to say
know
GE,
I don't know
know.
who builds them. So anyway, the slight improvement. These airplanes are circa 1961, 1962. Most of these aircraft are former VIP aircraft that were converted to this intelligence collection role. There are 17 of these aircraft in the current fleet in the Air Force. The RAF has just purchased 3 of them. So the Royal Air Force in the UK will be flying 3 RC-135s of their very own. And we have a unique aircrew exchange program with the RAF. In fact, we have RAF air crews flying on U.S. Air Force RC-135s, and in the past we have had U.S. Air Force crew members flying on RAF aircraft as well. There are two sister variants of this RC-135. There is an RC-135U model, which is affectionately called the Combat Cent. It's a little different, doesn't have the long nose, it has a little chin pod underneath. And there is one called the Cobra Ball, which has optical sensors on this side of the aircraft, and is used for ICBM indications and warning. But these are amazing airplanes packed with very sophisticated electronic sensors that is absolutely state-of-the-art. Okay. And it was an honor to serve.
Am I wrong, but this looks like it's the great-grandson of the old B-52s.
So this mission and this aircraft grew out of the old RB 57s, and which were converted bombers. Way back in the early 60s, the actual crew, which was much smaller, was in a capsule in the bomb bay of the bomber. So we have progressed through some of those old converted bomber aircraft, through the C-130 propeller-driven aircraft, through the EC-121 propeller-driven aircraft, and now we're flying these wonderfully modernized RC-135s, and they're going to continue to fly for many years to come.
And we're being faced with the drones coming down the pike too.
Absolutely,
unmanned. That's
unmanned. Well, and it's interesting because the community will be very quick to point out that they are not unmanned. There is a pilot flying them somewhere at a remote location, so they prefer the term remotely piloted vehicle.
Amen. 2 seconds, if you will.
Sure.
I would like very much if you would explain these two.
Sure.
You can hold them up.
So
there'll be the camera right there, so we can get a good look. Tell us what it signifies.
So these are chief aircrew wings. These are the wings that I earned during my career. You start off with a set of wings that does not have the star and the wreath on top, and after 7 or 8 years on flying status, you get a star to indicate you're a senior crew member. And after 15 years on flying status, you get the wreath to indicate that you are a chief enlisted aircrew member. So these are badges that are worn proudly to indicate the years of experience and everything that you've been through.
Tears.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Lots of long hours. My longest mission in an RC-135 was 22 and a half hours with 3 aerial refuelings. This is a chief enlisted intel badge, which was also part of the job. And
I'm going to interrupt you. We've got about 25 seconds. This is the fruit salad the young fella has earned. If you'll notice carefully, there are quite a few clusters. He wasn't just hanging around doing nothing. We're about time to climb out of this cockpit, if you will. I should have got here quicker. 2 words. I thank you.
Thank you,
and
Bob.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for letting me tell the story.
Amen. That's a wrap, folks. Thank you.